I used to think there were some people in life who were so familiar, so woven into your memories, that you never even considered the possibility that one day they could become strangers. Emily was that person for me. She had been in my life since we were little kids trading stickers on the playground and whispering secrets during sleepovers, and by the time we turned 21, she was less like a friend and more like a permanent extension of my past, someone my family trusted so completely that nobody ever questioned her presence in our house. My mom used to call her my second sister, which sounded sweet when I was younger and almost cruel when I looked back on it later, because there is something especially painful about being betrayed by someone who is welcomed into your home so many times that your parents stop treating them like a guest. Emily knew where we kept the tea, knew which cabinet door always got stuck, knew that my dad hated noisy television in the evening and that my mom answered work emails even during dinner, as if our house had slowly turned into a place where her footsteps belonged just as much as mine. From the outside, we looked like a normal family that had simply gotten too busy to notice its own cracks. My parents were still together, still shared a bed, still asked each other practical questions about groceries, bills, appointments, and weekend plans, but there was a coldness between them that had been growing for years, the kind that does not explode all at once but settles quietly into the walls until everybody starts living around it. My mom was always working, always exhausted, always mentally somewhere else, and even when she was sitting right there at the table, her attention felt divided between us and whatever crisis was happening on her phone. My dad never openly complained, which somehow made it sadder, because his disappointment came out in silence instead of anger, and silence has a way of making a house feel heavier than shouting ever could. At first, I told myself Emily was just being Emily, which meant a little too loud, a little too confident, a little too comfortable everywhere she went. She had always liked attention, always knew how to make a room tilt slightly in her direction, and for most of our lives I had seen that as part of her charm rather than a warning sign. The first time something felt wrong was so small that I almost felt embarrassed for noticing it. We were all having dinner together when my mom got up to answer a call, and Emily looked at my dad after he made some dumb joke and laughed in a slow, deliberate way that did not sound like her usual laugh at all. Then she said he did not look 40, that he looked younger than most men she knew, and the smile she gave him lingered just a second too long. I remember feeling this sharp flicker of discomfort that I immediately pushed down because it sounded ridiculous in my own head. She was my best friend, he was my father, and real life was not supposed to turn strange in such a stupid, obvious way. I told myself I was tired, oversensitive, maybe even weirdly jealous of nothing, so I brushed it off and acted normal. That became my pattern for the next few weeks, because once I noticed the first thing, I started noticing everything, and none of it was bad enough on its own to justify a confrontation, but all of it together began to feel like a quiet, ugly pattern I did not want to name. Emily started showing up more often, and sometimes she came over on days when we had no plans at all. She would text me that she was in the area, which made no sense because she lived 20 minutes away and never had a reason to be near my street unless she intended to be. When I was home, she always found some excuse to drift toward wherever my dad was, whether he was fixing something in the garage, making coffee in the kitchen, or sitting in the living room half watching the news after work. She asked him questions she could have Googled in 5 seconds, laughed at stories I had heard 100 times, and spoke to him with this bright, careful warmth that made me feel like I was standing just outside a conversation I was never meant to fully hear. The part that bothered me most was that my dad did not shut it down. I am not saying he encouraged it in some obvious, shameless way, because if he had, I think I would have reacted sooner, and maybe everything after that would have gone differently. What made it confusing was that he behaved like a man enjoying attention he had not asked for, but also had no intention of refusing. He smiled more around her than he had in a long time, looked less tired when she was there, and sometimes answered her with a softness that I had not heard in his voice when speaking to my mom for months. It was subtle enough to deny and clear enough to wound, which is probably the worst kind of truth because it traps you between suspicion and self-doubt. I almost said something to my mother twice, but each time I stopped myself because I knew how it would sound. My mom was already stretched thin, already carrying that brittle, overworked energy of someone who believed the only way to keep a family stable was to never stop moving, and I could not imagine sitting her down and saying that my childhood best friend was acting strangely around my father. Even in my own mind, the words sounded dramatic and ugly, like the plot of some cheap story told by people who confuse discomfort with evidence. I kept thinking I needed one clear moment, one thing I could point to without feeling insane, and until then I told myself I was protecting everyone by staying quiet. Then came the day I got the first real warning that I should have listened to sooner. I had texted Emily in the morning asking if she wanted to come over that evening, and she told me she was busy and probably would not make it. The message was casual, normal, easy to believe, and I did believe it because trust does not disappear the first time someone lies to you. It disappears after you realize how easily they did it. That afternoon my last class was canceled, and I decided to go home earlier than usual. I remember being in a good mood in that absent, ordinary way that makes bad moments hit harder later, because nothing inside me was prepared for the feeling waiting behind my front door. I was already thinking about taking a shower, making coffee, maybe convincing my mom to have dinner without her laptop open for once, and there was something almost peaceful about the routine of unlocking the house in the middle of the day, expecting it to be nearly empty. The first thing that made me pause was the unfamiliar silence, because our house had different kinds of quiet, and this one felt wrong, careful, like the air itself was holding its breath. Then I saw a pair of shoes by the entrance that I knew immediately, and for a second I just stared at them as if my brain needed a full extra moment to catch up with what my eyes had already understood. Emily had told me she was busy. Emily had told me she was not coming. Emily was in my house anyway. I called her name once, lightly at first, like I expected some harmless explanation to appear from the kitchen and make me feel stupid for even hesitating. No answer came, which only made my pulse rise faster, because Emily was not the kind of person who missed a chance to announce herself. I stepped farther inside and heard low voices coming from the living room, followed by the sudden stop that happens when people do not want to be overheard. That tiny break in sound told me more than any confession could have in that moment, and by the time I turned the corner, I already knew I was about to see something I would never be able to unsee in the same innocent way again. When I stepped into the living room, the first thing I noticed was how quickly both of them moved, not in a dramatic or obvious way, but in that small, instinctive adjustment people make when they are caught in a moment they cannot explain. My dad straightened up from where he had been leaning against the couch, and Emily shifted her posture just enough to create distance that had not been there a second earlier, and even though nothing about the scene looked explicitly wrong, the tension in the air was so thick it felt almost physical. Then I actually looked at her. Emily was wearing something I had never seen her wear before, at least not in my house, and definitely not on a random afternoon. She claimed she was too busy to visit. Her outfit was strikingly out of place, carefully chosen in a way that made it impossible to believe she had just thrown it on without thinking, and for a moment my brain tried to soften the reality by searching for some harmless explanation, like maybe she was on her way somewhere else, or had plans I did not know about, but that thought collapsed almost immediately under the weight of everything else I had already noticed. "Hey, I thought you were busy today," I said, and my voice sounded calmer than I felt, which only made the situation seem more surreal, as if I was watching myself from the outside trying to hold onto normality that had already slipped out of reach. Emily smiled, but it was not the same easy, careless smile I had known for years, because this one came with a delay, like she needed a second to decide which version of herself she was going to present to me. She said something vague about plans changing and being in the area again, repeating the same excuse she had used before, and I realized she was not even trying to make it convincing anymore, which somehow felt more insulting than if she had lied better. My dad said my name in that familiar tone that was supposed to ground the situation, as if I had just walked into an ordinary conversation and not something that made my chest tighten with a quiet, growing panic. He asked why I was home early, and I answered automatically, but my attention was no longer on what he was saying because every instinct in my body was focused on the space between them, on the way they avoided looking at each other for too long, on the strange awareness that had replaced their usual ease. There is a moment when confusion turns into clarity, not because something obvious happens, but because all the small, uncomfortable pieces suddenly fit together in a way you cannot undo. Standing there, I remembered every laugh that lasted too long, every unnecessary visit, every look I had convinced myself to ignore, and instead of feeling shocked, I felt something colder and heavier, like the slow realization that I had been lying to myself on purpose. "I need to talk to you," I said, looking directly at Emily this time, and there was no softness left in my voice. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know, because people who have nothing to hide do not need time to prepare themselves for a private conversation. We walked out of the living room together, leaving my dad behind in a silence that felt incomplete, like a sentence that had been interrupted before it could reveal its meaning. As soon as we stepped into the hallway, far enough that he could not hear us clearly, I turned to her and felt all the questions I had been suppressing finally push their way to the surface, not as scattered thoughts but as one clear, unavoidable demand for the truth. "What is going on between you and my dad?" For a second, she just looked at me, and I saw something in her expression that I had never seen before, not guilt in the way I expected, but something steadier, almost resolved, like she had already accepted this moment long before it arrived. She exhaled slowly, glanced past me as if making sure we were alone, and when she spoke, her voice was quieter than usual, but far more certain. "I didn't plan this," she said, and even before she continued, I felt my stomach drop because I already knew where this was going, "but I think I'm in love with him." The words did not hit me all at once. They settled in stages, each part of the sentence breaking something inside me in a slightly different way, until the full meaning stood there between us, impossible to ignore or reinterpret. I had expected denial, maybe excuses, maybe even anger, but not this calm, almost honest confession that made everything feel more real instead of less. "You're serious right now?" I asked, and I could hear the disbelief in my own voice, even though deep down I was already past the point of doubting her. She nodded again, and this time there was no hesitation at all. "I know how it sounds," she said, stepping a little closer as if that would make her words easier to accept, "but you don't see what I see. He's not happy. Your mom barely notices him, and I didn't mean for this to happen, but when I'm around him, it just feels different." Something about the way she said it, the quiet confidence mixed with justification, made a sharp wave of anger cut through the shock that had been holding me in place until then. It was not just what she felt that hurt, it was how easily she allowed herself to act on it, how quickly she turned my family into a situation she believed she could step into and rearrange. "That's my dad," I said, more firmly now, because I needed her to hear the boundaries she had already crossed, "and you're my best friend. You don't just get to decide something like this because it feels different to you." She looked at me with something that almost resembled sympathy, which only made it worse, because it meant she did not see herself as the villain in this situation, but as someone caught in a complicated story where feelings justified actions. "I didn't choose to feel this way," she said softly, "but I'm not going to pretend it's not real." In that moment, I realized that whatever we had been before, whatever years of shared memories and trust we had built, they were no longer enough to anchor us to the same reality. She had already crossed a line in her mind, and now she was standing on the other side of it, waiting for me to either follow or step away. And that was the moment I understood that staying silent was no longer protecting anyone. It was only giving this situation more space to grow into something that could destroy everything I still cared about. For a second, I just stood there, trying to process how everything had shifted so quickly from something I could ignore into something I could no longer escape. I didn't go back into the living room right away because I knew that if I looked at him in that moment, I would either say something I couldn't take back or stay silent in a way that would make everything worse. Instead, I stood there in the hallway, trying to steady my breathing while the weight of what I had just heard settled into something more solid than shock, something closer to a decision I could no longer avoid. Part of me wanted to protect what was left of normal, to pretend that if I handled this quietly, if I convinced her to back off, if I gave my dad the benefit of the doubt, maybe everything would fall back into place without breaking completely. But another part of me, the one that had been watching and noticing and denying for weeks, understood that silence was exactly what allowed this to get as far as it did. I looked at Emily one last time, really looked at her, and realized that the person standing in front of me was no longer the girl I grew up with, but someone who had made a choice and was now asking me, without saying it directly, to accept it. "I'm telling my mom," I said, and my voice came out steady in a way that surprised even me. Her expression changed for the first time, not into panic, but into something tense and disappointed, as if I had failed some expectation she had placed on me without my consent. "You're going to blow everything up?" she replied quietly. "No," I said, shaking my head, feeling that clarity settle deeper with every word. "You already did that. I'm just not going to pretend it didn't happen." I didn't wait for her answer after that. I walked past her, out of the house, and for the first time since I got home, I felt like I could breathe again, even though I knew the hardest part was still ahead of me. That evening, when my mom finally came home, she looked exactly the same as she always did, tired, distracted, already reaching for her phone before she even took off her coat, and for a second, I almost lost my nerve because it felt impossible that something this big could exist in the same space as something so ordinary. "Mom, can we talk?" I asked, and something in my tone made her stop. We sat down at the kitchen table, the same place where we had eaten hundreds of normal dinners, and I told her everything, not dramatically, not all at once, but clearly enough that there was no way to misunderstand what I was saying. I watched her face as she listened, saw the confusion first, then the disbelief, and finally something quieter and heavier, like a realization she had been avoiding for longer than I had. For a long moment after I finished, she didn't say anything. She just sat there, looking down at her hands, and when she finally spoke, her voice was softer than I had ever heard it. "I think I've been gone for a long time, even when I was here." It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't denial. It was something closer to honesty than I expected, and somehow that made it harder and easier at the same time. That night, she talked to my dad. I didn't hear the whole conversation, only fragments of raised voices and long pauses, but for the first time in years, it sounded like they were actually saying what they had been holding back instead of avoiding it. The next weeks were uncomfortable in a way that felt real, not hidden behind routine or silence. They started going to therapy together, not as a quick fix, but as something they were willing to try because ignoring the problem was no longer an option. Emily texted me more than once, long messages trying to explain, justify, even apologize in her own way, but I didn't answer. Some lines, once crossed, don't leave space for negotiation, and I knew that keeping her in my life would only keep that fracture open. A few weeks later, I saw her again. Not because I wanted to, but because some endings don't wait for your permission. She was standing outside a cafe near my college, and for a second, it felt like nothing had changed, like we were still those same girls who used to share everything without thinking twice. She smiled when she saw me, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said. I looked at her, really looked this time, and realized that maybe she believed that, which somehow made it worse. "You didn't just hurt me," I replied calmly. "You crossed a line you knew was there." She opened her mouth like she wanted to say more, but I didn't give her that chance. "Whatever you felt doesn't justify what you did." For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then I walked away, and this time, I didn't look back. I didn't just lose a best friend. I almost lost my family. And that was enough to understand that not everyone who grows up with you is meant to stay.